And all these kinds of literary devices they were using, which clearly distinguishes them in the way they were using them from other civilizations. With Ibn Sina, this period of the history of philosophy is much more about translating works from Greek into Arabic and then working with that material and thinking about how to improve or completely innovate based off of that, what was coming from Greek antiquity. The post-classical period, where there barely is a map, so to say. It's just an empty territory or a new territory that you just enter without really knowing where to go.
كأنه خريطة بتعرفك على يعني أبرز الكتب والأعمال اللي صدرت في الفترة دي، بتخليك تتعرف على الثقافة والفكر والآراء والتوجه وإيه المنهجية اللي كانت متبعة في الفترات دي. فهو كان يعني شايف انه فتره ما بعد الكلاسيكيه لا مش موجود المرجعيه دي، بخلاف الفتره الكلاسيكيه انه كانت فعلا في مرجعيه محدده جدا. احنا عارفين مين العلماء او مين المفكرين يعني اللي هم يعتبروا علامه في الفتره الكلاسيكيه. النهارده مركز دال بيستضيف دكتور إريك فان بندوة بعنوان الفلسفة الإسلامية ما بعد الكلاسيكية والبحث عن مرجعية. وهنشوف هنا طبعا دور الغزالي في ذلك. يعني هو دكتور إريك عضو في مركز ماكميلان في لدراسات الشرق الأوسط في جامعة ييل بأمريكا، وحصل على درجة الدكتوراه من جامعة أوتريخت بهولندا في تخصصه العلوم الدينية والفلسفة الإسلامية. مهتم جدا بالفلسفة الإسلامية في الفترة من أواخر العصور الوسطى وأوائل العصر الحديث. وهنا كانت الإشكالية اللي وجدها يعني أو اشتغل واشتغل في البحث عليها نظرا لصعوبة دراسة تاريخ الفكر الإسلامي في الفترة دي، وما فيش إنه وغياب المرجعية المتماسكة لدراسة الفلسفة في الفترة دي. وهو شايف إن هي مدخل مهم جدا لدراسة ثقافة وفكر وفلسفة أي مجتمع على مر الأزمنة والعصور على مدار التاريخ. هيناقش النهارده يعني باعتبار ان دي الوسيله الافضل ازاي هي الطريقه المثلى ان احنا نكون او نحدد بيها المرجعيه، وهيعرض رايه بخصوص الموضوع ده والى اي مدى الاشكاليه دي بتشكله تساؤل كبير جدا هو عايز يعني يتبحر في البحث فيها. هقدمه طبعا باللغه الانجليزيه او يعني تاني، وهتكون الندوه باللغه الانجليزيه. واي استفسارات يعني هنوفر يعني ترجمه لو في اي سؤال او كده على مدار العرض. اوكي. So good afternoon everybody. Thank you all for coming. So today Dal Center is pleased to host Dr. Irik van Lith, postdoctoral associate at the Macmillan Center for Middle East Studies at Yale University, and holds his PhD degree at Utrecht University at the Netherlands. His main interests lie in Islamic intellectual history, in particular philosophy from the late medieval and early modern period. Through his today lecture entitled Post-Classical Philosophy, The Search for Canon and Al-Ghazali place in it, Dr. Van Lith will discuss the difficulty of studying the late medieval and early modern period for Islamic intellectual history, that primarily due to the ocean of literature produced in that period and the lack of canon, focusing on what a canon is useful for, and how far the lack of canon means a total chaos. Whatever the canon will turn out to be for the post-classical period, definitely Al-Ghazali needs to be a part of that. But the question is, did he have a negative or a positive influence on later philosophers? Our guest shall discuss that in more depth and make a significant contribution showing how an answer is impossible at this moment. And will conclude by giving his opinion on what the best method will be to establish a canon for post-classical Islamic philosophy. After that, we will open the floor for your questions and different interventions. And for now, just join me in welcoming Dr. Aled Van Vliet.
Thank you and assalamu alaikum. وشكرا لتنظيم هذا الاجتماع. فأريد أن أتكلم هذا اليوم عن المشكلات لدراساتنا في تاريخ الفلسفة الإسلامية من القرون الوسطى، يعني المرحلة ما بعد الكلاسيكية، خاصة البحث عن المرجعية ومقام حجة الإسلام إمام الغزالي فيها. وليا لم أتكلم اللغة العربية كاملا، سأستمر في الإنجليزية الآن. So what I would like to talk about today is the history of post-classical Islamic philosophy. And post-classical is the period beginning with Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who died in 1037 or 428 Hijri. And it ends approximately with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. And this period, it's of course a very long period, about 900 years, but it is truly one period. And there are some aspects to it that make it one period, one cohesive whole. So the first aspect of it, that it is within one civilization, right? The Islamic civilization spanning from the Maghreb, Andalusia, until Indonesia, and from Crimea to Zanzibar, if you will. And this whole region was held together as one civilization by certain cultural practices, by certain economic practices. And this also translates into another unifying aspect, namely the language. Arabic remained for this entire period the language of science and of philosophy. Even though Persian also gained some ground, Arabic remained the lingua franca of this entire region and of this entire period. And all these thinkers, all these intellectuals from the 11th century up until the late 19th century, early 20th century, they were all operating within one paradigm. They understood each other in the sense that they had the same concepts and the same questions, the same kind of answers. This in opposition, say, to for example, Europe or the Far East, China, for example. Now, it's also one period when we just talk about the history of philosophy. It's also truly one period in the sense that they had a particular way of writing, and one very interesting aspect of this period is that they wrote a lot of commentaries, shuruh wa hawashi, and all these kinds of literary devices they were using, which clearly distinguishes them in the way they were using them from other civilizations. And then the last point, I call this post-classical because it is different from before and also from after. It's different from before, sort of this formative and classical period of the early Islamic history ends with Ibn Sina. This period of the history of philosophy is much more about translating works from Greek into Arabic and then working with that material and thinking about how to improve or completely innovate based off of that, what was coming from Greek antiquity. And by the time of Ibn Sina sort of single-handedly changed that whole kind of paradigm. And afterwards, Muslim intellectuals, or I should say Islamic intellectuals, weren't so much concerned anymore with the Greek works, but were rather concerned with the works of Avicenna, and sort of this really began a new era. And the same also goes for after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We can definitely see an entire shift in discourse among Muslim intellectuals, where at that point, at the beginning of the 20th century, the interest in sort of the older discourse, in the older text, began to wane, and virtually all their effort was spent and is still spent on engaging with modernity and sort of with sort of more of a global discourse rather than the narrower Islamic discourse. Now, what is very interesting about this period, or should I maybe stop here and have you translate a little bit? Sure.
هو احنا دكتور إريك هنحدد الفترة اللي هيكون هيتناولها في العرض، هي ابتداء من ابن سينا في القرن الحادي عشر حتى سقوط الدولة العثمانية 1900 في القرن العشرين. وهنا يعني بيظهر واستثنائية الفكر هنا، أو استثنائية المفكرين الإسلاميين في الفترة دي هم مختلفين عن بخلاف الغرب اللي هم ترجموا من اللاتينية وترجموا من حضارات غربية وأرض أخرى. هم لديهم سمات خاصة بهم ولغة معينة في تتضح جدا في فكرهم وكتاباتهم وأدبياتهم، ولذلك هو تناول الفترة بتاعت البوست كلاسيكال أو الفلسفة، تاريخ الفلسفة فلسفة الفكر الإسلامي ما بعد الكلاسيكية. Okay, you can continue.
تمام، شكرا. So this whole period has been not studied very much, and the reasons for it not being studied much has much to do with a theory that has been sort of held in high esteem in academic circles. And I'm talking here, I must of course say, I am talking here about Western academic circles, right? When I say not discussed much, I'm talking about sort of my own field of studies, Islamic studies. And within this field, scholars have sort of, for the last, say, 150, 200 years, accepted a decline theory, a theory that says that after the 11th century, there was a steep decline in intellectual activity in the Islamic world, and that the Islamic world sort of never really recovered from that, that it was really something, the productivity that we saw in the classical period was never there in the post-classical period. So goes the theory. And there are 5 reasons for it, or at least 5 arguments are being proposed. And the first argument is that the sort of the learned circles, the ulama, they were hostile to the use of reason and the use of logic. This is an argument that was proposed by one scholar in the early 20th century, Goldziher, and he listed and cited a whole list, a long list of ulama from throughout the centuries, really, and citing all these examples of alims who were either had a ruling or had a very sort of foul saying against philosophy. And I will also go later into sort of answering all these objections, because all these objections have since been answered, really. So the first one's the hostility of the ulama, and the second one is what's called the closing of the gates of innovation, right? The Bab al-Ijtihad. So this was sort of seen as another argument that innovation and sort of free thinking was not possible anymore in this later period. Now the third aspect, the third argument is that there's so much literature coming from this period, from the 11th century until the 19th century. There's this ocean of literature being produced that scholars simply argued, well, if it's so much that's being produced, then there must be, it can only be attained if there is a lot of repetition in it and if there is virtually no originality in it. So again, this was an argument to say they were merely just repeating each other. The fourth argument is that what I already pointed out, one very interesting aspect of this period is that there were a lot of commentaries written, and the argument was made that commentary writing is inherently unoriginal because it's always derivative, and always the work you're commenting upon must be much more original than what you have to say, because a commentary, what can a commentary do? So goes the argument, can only elucidate the original text. And the fifth argument was that Al-Ghazali, whom I will speak about a little bit more later on, has a very strong condemnation of philosophy. And his text, Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, this contains a ruling that sort of has the looks even as a legal ruling, a fatwa, condemning the use of philosophy, or at least severely restricting it. And since Al-Ghazali died in 1111, it seemed to correspond quite precisely with this perceived decline. And so it was said that this condemnation also sort of began this decline. Very briefly, answers to these objections is, so the hostility of the ulama, this has basically been a back and forth kind of discussion ever since it was started, where one scholar would produce a list of ulama who were against logic and philosophy, and then another scholar would simply produce a list of ulama who were all in favor. So, and it again sort of shows this ocean of literature and this this huge amount of evidence that is left from the Islamic civilization, from its heritage, that it's really difficult to make these kinds of statements, because you can always pick 100 examples in favor of philosophy and 100 examples against philosophy. Now, as far as the argument of the closing of the gate of ijtihad goes, it should be pointed out that this, of course, pertains specifically to fiqh, and so it's not at all obvious that this would have any bearing on philosophy or the sciences. So it seems a rather moot argument. Now, as for this argument about that there's so much literature produced in this period that it must just be repetitive, this is really an argument that we'll go into a little bit more, because it is due to the lack of a canon. And I'll explain in a minute what exactly canon is, etc., etc. But for now, just want to point out that it is really more an argument made because people are so they feel it's such a daunting task to pick up all this material that they rather just leave it altogether. This fourth argument about commentaries being unoriginal, well, actually, I'm here in Cairo to attend a conference on commentary writing in the Middle Ages of the Islamic world. This was a 3-day conference hosted by the Dominican Institute, Institut Dominicain des Études Orientales, and it drew scholars from all over the world to discuss what is commentary writing exactly. And we concluded that, I mean, we were all in agreement that commentaries could very well be original, that there is a lot going on in these commentaries that has nothing to do really with the base text, the text that they're commenting upon. As far as Ghazali's condemnation, I think we'll get into it later as well. Just want to mention that the opposite basically is also said, that the verdict is still out on that. So maybe you can give a brief summary of that. Thank you.
هي كان اتكلم دكتور إريك عن أسباب يعني لو بنتكلم في نظرية أو انهيار للفترة دي، فكان ولما كتب الغزالي عن تهافت الفلاسفة فكان بأسباب إنه كان في تيار شايف إنه العلماء يعني تراجعوا عن استخدام اللوجيك أو المنطق في فلسفتهم، زائد إن كان في يعني معدل كبير جدا من الأدبيات والكتابات في الفترة دي، لكن كان معظمها كلها إعادة للكتب أو يعني تفسير لحاجات مكتوبة، ما كانش فيه تجديد، ما كانش فيه جديد، زائد إن كان فيه غلق لباب الاجتهاد في الفترة دي. لكن في رأي معارض للنظرية دي وشايف إنه يعني كان يعني لو كان في أدبيات كتير مكتوبة، لكن يعتبر إنه في جزء منها هيكون في صالح إن هما بيستخدموا المنطق، وفي أدبيات تانية هتكون أكيد بتدل إنه لأ، كان في فعلا إن هما يعني عرضوا عن استخدام المنطق واستخدموا منهجية أخرى في الكتابة والتفكير وهكذا. هنتعمق أكتر في موضوع كمان تهافت الفلاسفة العمل يعني أعمال الغزالي بشكل أخص من خلال العرض، يعني عشان نرد على الآراء اللي مع أو ضد النظرية دي.
So let us now talk a little bit about what a canon is, right? A canon is a list of works considered to be permanently established as being of the highest quality. So it's a canon is a list of, say, the 50 or the 100 most important authors or books or pieces of art that are considered to be the most important. And it just gives you a very straightforward introduction to a certain topic, right? So it could be the canon of the history of Egypt or the canon of the history of modern art, or in this case, the canon of Islamic philosophy. And what a canon does, it's a general law or a rule or a principle or a criterion by which something is judged. So because it gives you such a straightforward introduction to something, it also helps you to compare new things with it and to see what the quality is of something. So a canon of literature, whether it be philosophy or prose, is always subjective, right? This is also something we should be aware of. There are always cases in which the choice came about due to some temporary circumstances, something that we now find very relevant, that's something we might be looking for in history and uphold as very important. And the opposite can also be true, because a subject is taboo nowadays. We might not dare to include it in the canon. And for example, one example that comes to mind, in American literature, there are some authors who are considered to be very important, but in their lifetime, 100 years ago, they were themselves blatant racists. And so now is the question, do we accept these authors still as part of our canon, or should we leave them out because we do not consider their personal opinion to be something that we agree with? Now, there can also be political reasons, right, to include or exclude one or the other work. And other random restrictions can also come into play. For example, we may want to select, say, the best 50 books. Now, does that mean that number 51 is rightfully excluded, right? That's of course a very close call. So in short, a canon is far from objective. It's not really objective, but it still provides us a very important function. And Now we're going to go a little bit sort of into theory. So we'll be a little bit, we're going to try to do a little bit of literary theory here. And it comes from Moratti, a literary theorist, from his book Distant Reading. And this is the passage that really speaks to me. And he says here, one last thing that became clear was the enormous difference between the archive of the great unread and the world of the canon. You enter the archive and the usual coordinates disappear. All you can see are swarms of hybrids and oddities for which the categories of literary taxonomy offer very little help. And then to make matters worse, there's the opposite problem too. Working with large quantities, the average becomes an inevitable presence. And the average means loss of distinction, slowness, and boredom. So let me give you an image here to try to understand what he's saying here, or better understand what he's saying here. If we use the image of a territory, just a geographical space, right? For example, this city or this country. And then if we consider its map, then these classic function, then these classics that Moratti speaks of, they function as the usual coordinates, right? Which Moratti speaks of, and it's these usual coordinates that gives you a sense of where you are on the map. The great unread is therefore sort of a new territory for which these usual coordinates disappear because the canon has not been established yet. Everything you see when you enter this new territory is both odd as well as average. Sort of a strange paradox here. So let's make it more concrete and just think of a city where you go to as a tourist, right? And if you go to a city as a tourist, you probably have a map with all the highlights on it. And sightseeing will be easy. You will come back from the trip confident that you have seen all the important historical and cultural sites. But what if you simply arrive to a city, any city, and you don't have a map? It's a big city, that much you know, but there's no map and no one seems to be able to tell you what you should see. Then chances are that you'll just be sort of wandering aimlessly through the streets. And you will see old buildings and you might see museums, but you wonder, should I go in? Should I take a picture? Is this important? You have no way really of telling. And so we have a very similar situation when it comes to Islamic philosophy and the distinction between the classical period, which has a map and which has all the highlights on the map where you can easily go to, and the post-classical period where there barely is a map, so to say. It's just an empty territory or a new territory that you just enter without really knowing where to go. Maybe you can take it from here.
وهنا بنتكلم عن الإشكالية في غياب مرجعية يعني محددة للفترة اللي هي البوست كلاسيكال ما بعد الكلاسيكية. إن هي غير الفترة الكلاسيكية اللي هي ليها مرجعية، وإنه هو بيشبه يعني نسق الفلسفة أو المرجعية إن هو كأنه خريطة بتعرفك على يعني أبرز الكتب والأعمال اللي صدرت في الفترة دي، بتخليك تتعرف على الثقافة والفكر والآراء والتوجه وإيه المنهجية اللي كانت متبعة في الفترات دي. فهو كان يعني شايف إنه فترة ما بعد الكلاسيكية لا مش موجود المرجعية دي، بخلاف الفترة الكلاسيكية إنه كانت فعلا في مرجعية محددة جدا. إحنا عارفين مين العلماء أو مين المفكرين يعني اللي هم يعتبروا علامة في الفترة الكلاسيكية دي. وبتكون مدخل أو بتكون طبعا أشخاص وأعمال متفق عليهم عالميا إن هم بيكونوا بيستخدموا طبعا في الدراسة والأبحاث عن الفترات دي ومنهجية الفكر فيها.
Now, until recently, I did not really appreciate the terms classical and post-classical in application to Islamic intellectual history, because I felt that it had a certain value judgment baked into it, namely that there was first a golden, original, good period of writing, the classical period, and then a period of supposedly lesser writings, derivative, and always losing out in comparison to the earlier period. And is this not exactly the prejudice that from which we wanted to break free? But in terms of the canon and the great unread, as Moretti here sort of compares the two, right? The canon and the great unread. These terms make sense. The classical period is that period for which the classics have been more or less identified, and they act as waypoints through the centuries of the classical period, allowing a student to get a sense of direction and importance. And for the post-classical period, we do not have this list of classics. A canon has not been established yet. So in fact, when we think back of the tourist going to a city, for the post-classical period, the map that is available does not only miss the sights to be seen, it hardly has all the streets of the city on it. I'm thinking of another image that might only speak to the guys here in the room, but it's much like a video game where the map of the area that you're able to explore is first completely black, and then as you progress through the video game, parts of the map that you visit, they become available, right? And so in other words, you need to construct the map yourself by going everywhere. And this is similar here in this post-classical period. From Ibn Sina to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that's our current situation. A vast, huge, but little explored territory. And so the untrained eye, in fact, even the trained eye, the scholars, they have almost no idea where to look first. And then when you look, you too often see nothing but repetition. And so, and thus have most scholars of the previous century concluded that this period is one of decline and unoriginality, and therefore not really worthy of studying. So this sort of concludes the first part then of my talk here. Please.
Okay. هو كان هنا يعني تلخيص للمقدمة اللي احنا يعني من أول المحاضرة بنتكلم عن غياب المرجع للفترة دي، والنص اللي عرضناه للموارتي إن هو فعلا بيؤكد إنه الفترة دي ما كانش فيها المرجعية، وده اللي دفع إنه يعني هو إنه بيحتم عليه إن هو يبحث عنها ويحاول إن هو يحدد أصلا ملامح الفترة دي من خلال الكتب، وإن هو بما إن ما فيش مرجعية فهو دور المفكرين في الفترة الحالية ان هم اللي يتحروا او يشوفوا الماب دي او الخريطة اللي هو بيشبهها ان هي عاملة ازاي، ويتعمقوا اكتر في دراسة الفترة ما بعد الكلاسيكية.
شكرا. So this showed this should show sort of the importance of a canon, and should also show to you that the lack of a canon is really problematic. And I will show you now exactly how problematic the lack of a canon has been for the study of Islamic philosophy. And so I'll just give you first a few statements of some very important scholars, very influential scholars. And pretty much the first one was Ernest Renan, a Frenchman in the 19th century. And he says, and I give it here in the original, if you know French, then you can read with me. He says, basically from the 12th century onwards, the theological response took hold, and philosophy is abolished in the Muslim world. It's a very sort of, rather simple statement, and sort of in two sentences he just does away with this entire post-classical period, right? In these two sentences he he claims that nothing to see here. Now we see this again repeated, and I've highlighted in bold and underlined the year of publication, so that you have a sense that this narrative that is established by Ernest Renan is sort of continued through time here. So here we have Karl Brockelmann, who says, with a little bit of humor, he says that in these centuries in Egypt and in Syria, there would still be a lot of paper covered with ink, but nothing substantial written. So it's again a very crude statement where in one swoop he just does away with this entire period. This is also continued in Tjitse de Boer's history of Islamic philosophy. This is basically, what you see here is the first book on history of philosophy in Islam in a European language, and was published in 1901, and it proved to be hugely influential for our studies. And he says here as well that in the 11th century, the first university was erected in Baghdad, and since then, knowledge has only been sort of passed on from teacher to student, and any book that came out afterwards did not contain a single new sentence. So you see again this sort of very radical kind of thinking about this period. Here as well, a little bit later, 1964, more specifically about logic, and pushing the time limit a little bit later by about 1500, right? This process of logical study sort of disintegrated into a purely text-oriented, what he calls comment mongering, and then he concludes that logic was dead in Islam as a branch of inquiry. Well, he's been proven wrong, but at that time, this was the thinking. Now, slightly later, we have pretty much the same statement here, that no new knowledge was produced, but only old new knowledge was repeated. And we finally arrive here also with a very influential book, unfortunately influential, where Montgomery Watt claims here that that little originality was shown, and the chief effort of theologians went into the production of commentaries, super commentaries, and glosses on earlier works. Now, that was sort of just their off-the-cuff thinking, and what this then does to their actual work, or what this does to our actual sort of state of knowledge, becomes clear when we just look at table of contents. So I'll just give you 3 table of contents. They're all from books on history of philosophy in Islam. And the first one's from 1900, second one's from around 1950, and the third one's from around 2000. So you see the entire sort of progress of the last century there. Now, the first was written by a fellow countryman of mine, a Dutchman, Tjitse de Boer. And he wrote what I already quoted earlier. He wrote this influential book on the history of philosophy in Islam. And if we look at his table of contents here, then I don't give his full table of contents. Just, he has a huge part on the classical period, right? And then he arrives at Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and he spends about 12 pages on Ibn Rushd. And then from Ibn Rushd in the 12th century, he jumps to Ibn Khaldun in the 14th, 15th century, and then it just stops. So basically, according to Tjitse de Boer, Islamic philosophy simply stops with Averroes, and Ibn Khaldun is more sort of an afterthought, if you will. But for Tjitse de Boer, there is no post-classical Islamic philosophy. It simply doesn't exist, right? It does not appear. Not a single page, basically, is spent on it in his book. So you see here the thinking or the state of knowledge of scholars around 1900. Now, if we move forward in time, we have Henri Corbin, who was a French scholar and was very interested in Islamic philosophy, but especially in philosophy coming from Iran, and sort of the intellectual thinking that was coming out of Shi'i circles. And he was really bothered by this whole idea of Chitsedebur, that there was no philosophy after the 12th century. So he really wanted to do something about it. But if we look what he is able to do, it's unfortunately sort of not too much. So here we see, again, you can see that the page number starts at 253, right? So I skipped the earlier parts. He spends, again, huge amount on the classical period. And then he comes to the post-classical period. And what you see is that, you know, he does mention some names, but it all goes by in such a huge pace. Like all these different people are treated on sometimes not even a single page, right? If we look at Al-Abhari, Ibn Sab'in, and Al-Katibi, Al-Kazwini, they're all treated of on the very same page. So he knows a name here and there, but he doesn't know anything substantial to say on it. And again, if we, I don't have all the dates I don't have all the dates for all these people, but they are spread out through this entire post-classical period. So he takes long steps, so to say, to get through this period. And then what he also does is, because maybe because he felt that it was just so, that he didn't know exactly what to fill this period up with, he just included Sufism as well. And maybe you can make an argument for it, but on the other hand, it is also a little bit odd. And then he comes to Shi'i thought, and you can see that he's much more confident there, where he spends more time on Shi'i authors. So it's in a way it's a sort of a laudable effort, but we still see that that he's making these big steps and doesn't exactly know what to say about it. And then perhaps the best example is the one closest to us, and it sort of represents the state of knowledge of our field of about 20 years ago. Since then we have improved, but it comes from Majid Fakhri. I didn't have a good big picture of him, so I just put two pictures of him. I thought it made more sense. And I think he's still alive, so God bless his heart. So he wrote a very important book, History of Islamic Philosophy, which is basically the standard work currently. And here we see the table of contents. And so, and we see here a couple of things that we should note. So he begins here by saying post-Avicennan developments, right? So Majid Fakhri understands that there is a post-classical period that starts with Avicenna, because his first chapter there is post-Avicenna, so what happens after Avicenna. And we can also see that he understands that it ends really in the 20th century when he has modernist and contemporary trends. It starts here on page 303 and it ends here on page 345. So in a mere 40 pages, he discusses 900 years of Islamic intellectual history. So again, we see that he needs to take these very big steps, and in fact names less authors than Henri Corbin did to fill up this period. So I think these table of contents, they confirm the unity of this period, right? That there is this post-classical period, and they further show that our knowledge on it is very slim. And lastly, they show that we do not have a canon, because these three authors, these three books, are not exactly in agreement with each other. Oh, yeah? Okay. All right. So I'd now like to move on to more concrete example. And this example is Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali is a name that really stands out, that doesn't need much introduction. I will give a brief overview of him, but sure that you've all heard of him, and it's therefore one of those names that stand out and that you would think it should be included in this canon, right? So let me just sort of introduce Ghazali here and his work, the Tahawut al-Falasifa. Al-Ghazali started his career in 11th century Nishapur in the east of present-day Iran, and he eventually ended up in the most prestigious academic and religious position in Baghdad, and in fact was also the political advisor to the rulers. Excuse me. And Baghdad was, of course, the capital of the most powerful Islamic empire of his time, that of the Seljuks. Now, remarkably, he left everything behind. He was at the height of his career in Baghdad, and one day he just left the city unannounced, and he wandered for a few years through the Middle East and eventually returned to Nishapur. Now, his writings, and he has many writings, but his writings roughly mirror these two periods of his life. There's a hot-headed Al-Ghazali who writes about what heresy is and defends the true doctrine from error. And there's also a cool-headed Al-Ghazali who writes about what Islam actually is and how the different elements of tradition, reason, and spirituality can come together. And so these sort of mirror his life, whereas before his leave from Baghdad, he was always busy sort of with career building and really active in the empire. And after he left Baghdad, he was much more focused on his own sort of spiritual development. Now, for the cool-headed Al-Ghazali, his most important work is, of course, the revival of religious knowledge, Ihya Ulumuddin. It's a 40-volume guide to Islamic spirituality, and it can, of course, still be found in many Muslim homes around the world today. And for the hot-headed Al-Ghazali, his magnum opus is certainly the incoherence of the philosophers, the Tahawut al-Falasifa. Now, considering he finds in this book, he finds a fault with 20 ideas of the philosophers of his era, and he even declares them to be apostates on 3 counts. And he phrases this as sort of a legal advice, a fatwa, and as such, it carries, of course, much weight with it. Now, so considering Al-Ghazali's importance and the harsh tone of the book against philosophy, the incoherence at Tahawut is supposed to have given sort of a critical, critical rational inquiry in the Islamic world a death blow. And this idea that Al-Ghazali gave philosophy a death blow with the Tahawut again begins with Ernest Renan, this first French scholar from the 19th century that we saw, and it's repeated throughout the centuries up until just a few years ago. This was again sort of defended in scholarly literature. And in fact, this interpretation is so pervasive, it has even become a staple of contemporary discussions on the compatibility of Islam with the modern world. And I'd like to just briefly go over this because I think it's quite relevant for all of us today. In this contemporary discussion, there are people who would argue that after a golden age of free thinking, the Islamic world entered into a so-called dark age from which it never recovered. And Al-Ghazali is said to have played an essential role in this shift to a dark age. And again, especially with his book, Tahawut al-Falasifa. For example, the internationally renowned politician and activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali writes in her latest book, I think I have it here, she writes, in this process, a key role was played by the Imam Abu Hamid, Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali detested the ancient Greek philosophers and he regarded human reason as a cancer upon Islam. Okay. Now, similarly, the well-known American astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, this is an astrophysicist who's a lot in the media in the US and who plays an important role to communicate science to the general audience. And in one of his lectures, he stated the following. He said that out of Al-Ghazali's work, you get the philosophy that mathematics is the work of the devil, and the entire intellectual foundation of that enterprise, meaning Islamic intellectual discourse, collapsed, and it has not recovered since. And in fact, quite shockingly, in his presentation, Neil deGrasse Tyson shows pictures of the World Trade Center on 9/11, and sort of seems to, imply that part of the blame for those attacks falls on Al-Ghazali. Now, Al-Ghazali's book as the cause of the demise of philosophy in the Islamic world is also the center of a popular book by U.S. policymaker Robert Riley, and also in another popular book by Robert Spencer, sustains the same narrative. And in fact, Salman Rushdie's latest novel places centrally a battle between free thinking and orthodoxy, with the first represented by Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and the second by Al-Ghazali. So again, an obvious allusion to Tahafut al-Falasifa and the counter-commentary by Ibn Rushd, Tahafut at-Tahafut. Now, these assertions by such high-profile figures, they trickle down to the wider strata of society and they are intensely discussed on the lecture by Neil deGrasse Tyson. You can find it on YouTube, and in fact it has more than 800 comments, and luckily there are a lot of comments there that also defend Al-Ghazali and try to give more reason to the discussion. And in another article in The Guardian by the British Muslim philosopher Ziauddin Sardar, we could see up to 300 comments discussing Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa and the supposed decline of intellectual thought in the Islamic world. So now it is all the more strange to see this discourse proliferate, as the historical evidence is quite the contrary. And maybe we don't need to go into it deeply, but I will show you one passage of Tahafut al-Falasifa that should already make clear what these contemporary intellectuals, what they are saying is very far from the truth. So I'll just give you this, and it's coming from the introduction, the Muqaddimah from the Tahafut. And here Ghazali is saying, whoever thinks that to engage in a disputation for refuting such a theory, whoever thinks that to engage in a disputation for refuting such a theory is a religious duty, harms religion and weakens it, for these matters rest on demonstration, geometrical and arithmetical, that leave no room for doubt. So what he's saying here, and what he is sort of unpacking in the entire book, is that there is no inherent conflict between religion and the use of reason, right? There's no inherent conflict in the conclusions of philosophy or of science with religion. And in fact, if you would think so, and if you would try to sort of dismiss it out of hand, you're only doing yourself harm, because the proof speaks for itself, and so your blame of the proof is more a sort of telling of where you stand. Maybe we should briefly stop here. Should I continue here?
Actually, no, I don't want to.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Perfect. Yes.
Okay.
So.
Yes,
Your Arabic is very good. better than Ms. Khalid. Please talk in Arabic.
I wouldn't dare, no.
We agree. Please speak in Arabic.
So Al-Ghazali's aim in the Tahafut is a little bit paradoxical. Although he wishes to show the inconsistency of philosophy, he does so by using philosophy. What he does then is to show that if you use philosophy well, you do not arrive at the results of some philosophers like Farabi and Ibn Sina, but rather if you use your reason, your aql, if you use it well, you will arrive at results that are different from the philosophers. And only those different results are true, and these different results are in harmony with religion, with naqal, if you will. So in 20 chapters, he takes aim at the philosophers, showing how the results are not consistent. And for many things, this is sort of without consequence, simply a case of a silly mistake, if you will. But in 3 cases, as you may know, actually, he takes greater exception for the philosophers, and he feels that he cannot allow this. And these are the denial of the creation of the world, ibtal huduth al-alam, the denial of bodily resurrection, ibtal ma'ad jismani, and the denial of God's knowledge of particulars, ibtal ilm Allah li juziyat, right? And these are things that the philosophers adhere to. They do not in the huduth al-adam, they argue for qidam al-alam, the eternity of the world. And they do not think that ma'ad jismani is possible, they only think that ma'ad ruhani is possible. And lastly, they do not think that God knows particulars, yalimul juziyat, but that he only knows kulliyat, universals. And for Ghazali, these points are too big, so to say, to pass up on. And he ends his book with legalistic language that implies that Ghazali is issuing a fatwa here, if you will, that anyone who does adhere to these points stops being a Muslim, basically. Now, the ultimate verdict may sound harsh, but Ghazali clearly is favorable towards reason and even towards philosophy. Why do these philosophers come to wrong conclusions then? Well, Ghazali argues it's because they do not use their reason, but they actually cling to authorities, namely the ancients, taqlid bil qudama. And this is quite an interesting accusation, as often philosophers would proudly say that the masses, al-awam, only know by blind adherence, by taqlid, and that the philosophers are the elite, al-khawas, who know independently. But here, Al-Ghazali actually turns it around. The philosophers are really the ones who blindly follow, and he shows how one should really think. So this point is very subtle, and the misinterpretation of it is not entirely unusual then, right? So just to clarify, this misinterpretation would be to think that Al-Ghazali condemned philosophy and that people after him stayed away from philosophy due to Al-Ghazali's writings. This would be a misinterpretation. And in fact, scholars who have better understood Al-Ghazali, they have argued that perhaps Al-Ghazali did not give a death blow to philosophy in the later centuries, but actually did the opposite, gave a boost to it, if you will. Now this boost, it's an interesting idea, but again, it runs straight back into the issues of studying the post-classical period. Namely that the scholars who argue for Al-Ghazali's positive influence, they virtually give no evidence for this. So the result of this is that we suspect that Al-Ghazali and his Tahafut al-Falasifa belong to the canon of the post-classical period, that it is a very important book for this period. but we do not know exactly how. We do not know how important and whether it had a positive or a negative effect on the literature afterwards. So that brings me, with this little case study, it brings me to how do we solve such issues of interpretation, and how do we approach this post-classical period? And I think two methods lead the way. And the first is to investigate the commentary tradition, the shuruh. So the post-classical period is full of commentaries. And it seems that people really loved to write commentaries, whether it be a sharh, hashiyah, ta'alika, mukhtasar, mulakhas, muhakama, manzuma, or tarjama, all these different things, right? They're all sort of commentaries. They take an older text and they do something with it. And as such commentaries are perfect evidence for the reception of the importance of an older text. So with a combination of biobiographical works and so that would be tabakat literature, right? And together with manuscript research, the makhtutat, it can give you a pretty accurate picture of how many commentaries were written, by whom and when. And in fact, for Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, I in fact did so. And this is the result. I hope you can read it. I think so, right? So on top we have, this is from an article I published last year, and on top we have Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, and then we have the first commentary was written by Ibn Rushd, Tahafut al-Tahafut. And then actually in Europe, an Italian scholar wrote a super commentary on Ibn Rushd's commentary in Latin. The Tahafut al-Tahafut was translated into Latin and was read quite widely by European scholars. And there's one scholar from the 15th, 16th century who wrote a super commentary on it. Quite interesting, of course, to see that. Now, these two commentaries we sort of knew about, but in fact I discovered that there are many more commentaries on the Tahafut al-Falasifa, and they all come from the Ottoman Empire. It started here in the 15th century with Alauddin Tusi and Khojazadeh, and then on Khojazadeh there were a whole bunch of super commentaries with perhaps the most important one by Ibn Kamal Pasha. Ibn Kamal Pasha was what we think the most important intellectual from the Ottoman Empire. And I say this with a little bit of hesitance because, again, we are still trying to establish a canon. So, but Ibn Kamal Pasha would be a good candidate to be part of that. And so we see it here appearing again. So a list like this, it gives you a little handle on the reception history of the Tahafut. We know that it was at least important for these people. All these people took time out of their lives to sit down and write a text on this. Another method is a little bit more sophisticated, and we'll not go fully into it, but the second method relies on the fact that if people did not write a full commentary on an older text, they did often copy parts of text that they had read. So we want to search for specific bits of text of the Tahafut in as much literature as possible. We want to make really use of what Moretti calls the great unread, right? The great unread being that vast amount of literature that nobody in the modern period has really read. We want to sort of make most use of all that literature at the same time. And we are starting now to be able to do that. And one way is with use of databases. And very important database is a Maktaba Shamila, which is a database that contains many thousands of books, actually, from the Islamic civilization, and they've been fully digitized, meaning that the text of the book, the text inside the book, is also searchable. So when we search for a specific sentence of Ghazali's Tahafut, we will find all the books that copy this one sentence, and hence you get a sense of who was reading Ghazali's Tahafut again. But of course, you need to pick a very good sentence, right? It's the scholar's job to know which sentence to use for a search to give the most meaningful results back. And I've used this method in another case that I can show you here. And what we see here, let me see. Yeah, I think it's pretty well. I think you can see it all the way down here, right? So let me try to walk you through this schema. This is the reception history of a sentence, and the sentence begins with, "There is a magnitudinous world in existence. في الوجود عالما مقداريا." And this sentence, it was first written by As-Suhrawardi al-Maktul. It was a philosopher from the 12th century. And he wrote this sentence as part of his thinking on Alam al-Mithal. And for Suhrawardi, specifically, he called them al-Muthul al-Mu'allaka. It was a specific idea in his thinking on the afterlife. And this sentence sort of introduces his discussion of this new idea that he had. And then we see that authors picked up on this new idea, and they, whether they liked it or not, I don't know, but they at least felt compelled to copy this idea. And so we can trace the copying of this idea by following that sentence. And we see that sentence appear in all these different texts. In the next days, we see Sheikh Razuri make use of it, and then Qutbuddin Shirazi. And then from Qutbuddin Shirazi, we see that many people are reading Qutbuddin Shirazi's book, and this coming from his Sharh Hikmat al-Ishraq. And we see that actually throughout history, people have been reading his book and been using it. We see that as Qutbuddin Shirazi died in 1310, right? And only like 20, 30 years later, somebody else already copied it, an anonymous author. But also somebody who just died 2 years ago, he also made use of it. So we see that still up until today, these things are being used by philosophers in the Muslim world. And we see that sometimes, this transmission can take all these bends and turns coming to, this is Hassan Zadeh Amuli, this is actually an Ayatollah from Iran who uses this, and probably has no idea that originally it comes from Suhrawardi. He copies it from Lahiji. And he has no idea that it's coming from Suhrawardi because nobody here says that they took it from an earlier source. They just include it in their own text, and as though it is part of their own writings, if you will. But with our knowledge, of course, by just looking for this one sentence and seeing it in all of these texts, we know very well that these are not their own thoughts, of course, that they're copying different parts. And then, of course, based off that copying of that one sentence, they could still then add their own ideas, but it at least shows the discussion going through the centuries. What we see here in one picture is the post-classical period from Suhrawardi up until today. We have in one picture the post-classical period. And I think it's the idea that if we do this for one book, in this case Suhrawardi's Hikmat al-Ishraq, but if we also do it for Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, and we do it for other books written around the same time, 11th, 12th century, of the Common Era, then we can slowly start to see how each of these books was received in the later centuries. And from comparing these different results, I'm convinced that we can slowly start to see emerge a canon of those books that keep on playing a crucial role in post-classical Islamic philosophy. So I think it's an exciting time to be studying Islamic philosophy, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irik. I'm very sorry for not providing an immediate interpretation, but we will open the floor for your question. بعتذر عن يعني عدم ترجمة بالفورية دي، بس لو في حد عنده أسئلة أو أي مداخلة ممكن يسأل دلوقتي.